All right, strap in, everyone, because today we are going deep on Friedrich Nietzsche. Now, I know, Nietzsche can seem, well, intimidating, right?
Right.
God is dead, the Superman, all that.
Yeah.
But trust me on this one. This deep dive is going to make his ideas surprisingly accessible and maybe even a little bit life-changing.
What's so interesting about Nietzsche is that he didn't start out as this, radical, like iconoclastic figure. His early years were actually pretty traditional.
Yeah, you've given us a ton of material on him. Articles, biographies, excerpts from his actual work. And it seems like young Nietzsche was, well, a bit of a bookworm.
Right. He was
Started out as a classical philology student, obsessed with Greek tragedy poetry.
Right. Figures like Holderlin,
Right.
really fascinate him. And he wasn't just an academic, he was a talented musician, too.
Of course. The whole Wagner connection. That definitely shaped his early thinking.
Yeah.
But it's like there was this turning point, right?
Yeah.
Where Nietzsche went from studying the classics to, well, challenging the very foundations of Western thought.
Yeah. That break with Wagner and traditional philosophy was a major shift. And it's where we see him developing these radical critiques of truth, religion, morality. That's where he embraces perspectivism.
Okay, perspectivism. Let's break that down for a second. Because if there's no objective truth, doesn't that mean anything goes? How can we even make sense of the world if everyone has their own truth?
Well, Nietzsche's not saying that truth is irrelevant. What he's getting at is that truth is more complex and multifaceted than we often assume. Think of it like this. Imagine you're standing in a forest looking at a giant redwood tree. Your perspective, what you see and understand about that tree, is going to be different depending on where you're standing, right?
Yeah, totally. If you're like right next to it, you might just see bark. But if you're further away, you can see how it towers over everything else.
Yeah. Exactly. And no single perspective captures the entire tree. And it's the same with knowledge and truth. Our understanding is always shaped by our individual viewpoints, our experiences, our values. Perspectivism challenges us to recognize that our knowledge is always partial, always situated.
So it's not about rejecting truth altogether. It's more about realizing that there are multiple ways of seeing the world, and each has its own validity.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the limitations of any single perspective and being open to the possibility that other people might see things differently. And that can be a powerful tool for understanding, especially in a world that often seems so divided by these different truths.
Okay, that makes sense. But how does this all tie into Nietzsche's famous statement, God is dead? Is he literally saying that God died?
Well, it's not meant to be taken literally, no. It's more of a metaphor.
A metaphor for what?
Think of it as a diagnosis of his time. Nietzsche saw that the traditional foundations of Western civilization, religion, morality, this idea of absolute truth, they were crumbling. He saw the rise of science, secularism, and individualism. And he believed that these forces were fundamentally changing our relationship to the world and to ourselves.
So God is dead is less about a deity dying and more about the death of a certain worldview, a way of understanding the world that was no longer sustainable in his view.
Exactly. And this death, this upheaval, wasn't necessarily a bad thing for Nietzsche. He actually saw it as an opportunity, a chance to create something new, to reevaluate our values, to find new sources of meaning in a world that was no longer defined by those traditional beliefs.
Right. So this is where we get to those other big Nietzschean concepts like the will to power and the Superman, right?
Exactly. These ideas emerge from the ashes of the old world, so to speak. They're Nietzsche's attempt to grapple with the challenges and possibilities of a world without God.
But will to power. I mean,
Yeah.
doesn't that sound a little, well, power hungry? Like something a supervillain would say.
Yeah. It can be easily misinterpreted, especially if you take it out of context. It's not about dominating others or imposing your will on the world. It's a much more subtle and pervasive force. It's the fundamental drive in all living things to grow, to overcome obstacles, to strive for something more.
Okay, so it's less about conquering the world and more about conquering yourself, in a sense.
Yes. It's about pushing your own limits, realizing your full potential. Think of the energy of an artist creating a masterpiece or an athlete breaking a world record. That's the will to power in action.
So it's more like a creative force, a life force, the thing that drives us to become the best versions of ourselves.
And this drive, the striving, is what gives life meaning for Nietzsche. It's not about achieving some final goal, but about the journey itself, the constant process of self-overcoming and self-creation.
It sounds pretty profound. But how does the Superman fit into all of this? Because when I hear that word, I think of, well, comic books.
The Superman is one of Nietzsche's most misunderstood ideas. It's not about a literal superhero with superpowers. It's more of an aspirational figure, an ideal that embodies the will to power in its highest form.
So it's not about flying or X-ray vision. It's about pushing the boundaries of what it means to be human.
Yes, it's about transcending conventional morality, creating your own values, and living a life that is truly authentic and meaningful.
Okay, now that's starting to sound a little dangerous. Creating your own values, doesn't that lead to chaos?
That's a common concern, but Nietzsche isn't advocating for moral anarchy. It's not about just doing whatever you want without consequences. It's about taking responsibility for your choices, for shaping your own destiny, and for creating a life that is in alignment with your deepest values and aspirations.
So it's about freedom.
No.
But also responsibility.
Exactly. And for Nietzsche, that's the essence of what it means to be human, to be the author of your own life.
I'm starting to see why Nietzsche's still so relevant today, you know? We're living in a world that's constantly changing, where traditional values are being questioned, and where I think we're all trying to figure out what it means to live a good life.
And Nietzsche gives us a framework for thinking about these questions in a totally new way. He challenges us to question our assumptions, to embrace our freedom, and to create meaning in a world that often feels meaningless.
And to do all that without a cape and tights?
Exactly. It's about the inner transformation, the evolution of consciousness. And that's where his ideas become truly powerful, I think.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Perspectivism, the death of God, the will to power, the Superman. It's a lot to digest, but I'm starting to see how how these ideas all fit together.
And this is just the beginning. Nietzsche's philosophy is like a labyrinth full of twists and turns.
Well, I'm ready to get lost in it. Let's keep going.
So with that in mind, let's move on to some of his other challenging ideas.
Like eternal recurrence. That one always makes my head spin.
Exactly. Let's explore that in part 2 of our deep dive into the world of Nietzsche.
Okay, so we left off talking about this whole eternal recurrence thing. And I have to admit, this is one of those Nietzschean concepts that really throws me for a loop. Is he saying that we're all stuck in some cosmic time loop, like living the same life over and over again for eternity? Because honestly, that sounds kind of terrifying.
It's definitely one of his most provocative and challenging ideas. And like a lot of things with Nietzsche, it's easy to misinterpret. He wasn't necessarily saying that eternal recurrence is like a literal cosmological fact. It's more of a thought experiment, a way of pushing us to really examine the quality of our lives.
Okay, a thought experiment. So how does that work exactly? What are we supposed to be thinking about here?
Well, imagine this. What if you had to live your life, like every single moment of it, with all its joys and sorrows, its, triumphs and failures, over and over again for all eternity? Would you embrace that idea with open arms, or would you kind of recoil in horror?
To be honest, my initial reaction is closer to horror. I mean, who wants to relive their awkward teenage years or, that time they accidentally sent a text to the wrong person?
Exactly, and that's the point. Nietzsche is forcing us to confront the choices that we make, the values we live by, and the experiences that shape us. If the thought of eternal recurrence fills you with dread, it might be a sign that you're not living a life that's truly fulfilling, a life that you would willingly repeat.
So it's like a test, a way of measuring like how much we're embracing life, how much we're aligned with our, true self.
Precisely. And it's a high bar. But the beauty of eternal recurrence is that it challenges us to strive for something more, to make choices that we wouldn't regret, even if we had to live with them forever.
It's almost like saying, live each day as if it were your last, but also your first, and every day in between.
That's a great way to put it. It's about finding a way to live with such intensity and purpose that even the thought of eternal repetition becomes not a burden, but a source of joy.
I'm starting to see how this idea, as unsettling as it might seem at first, can actually be incredibly motivating. It pushes us to ask ourselves, like, am I living a life I love, a life that's truly mine?
And that's really at the heart of Nietzsche's philosophy. He's not interested in handing down a set of rules or dogmas. He wants us to awaken to the possibilities of existence, to create our own values, and to live lives that are worthy of being repeated, even infinitely.
So instead of fearing the loop, we should be striving to make it a loop worth repeating.
Exactly. And that brings us back to the will to power, because it's through that drive, that striving, that we can shape our lives and make choices that we won't regret, even in the face of eternity.
Okay, I think I'm starting to wrap my head around this, as mind-bending as it is. But we've been talking a lot about these like big abstract ideas. I'm curious to see how they actually play out in the real world. You mentioned earlier that Nietzsche's influence extends beyond philosophy. So where do we see his fingerprints popping up in these unexpected places?
That's where it gets really exciting. because Nietzsche's ideas have resonated in so many different fields: art, literature, psychology, even pop culture. His influence is much broader and more pervasive than I think a lot of people realize.
All right, give me some examples. Convince me.
Well, let's start with literature. Think of Dostoevsky's novels, with his characters wrestling with existential angst, the search for meaning in a godless world, the consequences of radical freedom. Those are all themes that Nietzsche explored deeply.
Right, I can see that connection. Dostoevsky's characters are always pushing boundaries, testing limits, questioning everything.
Exactly. And it's not just Dostoevsky. You think of Thomas Mann's Death in Venice, with its exploration of beauty, decadence, and the will to power. Or even someone like Jack London, whose adventure tales often echo Nietzsche's emphasis on embracing challenge and pushing beyond one's comfort zone.
Wow, I never thought about it that way, but you're right. There's a definite Nietzschean thread running through a lot of classic literature.
And it's not just limited to the classics. These themes of self-discovery, rebellion against societal norms, and creating meaning in a meaningless world, you see that all over modern literature, film, even music. Think about some of your favorite dystopian novels or those superhero stories where the hero has to forge their own path outside the conventional rules. Those are all grappling with questions that Nietzsche was wrestling with over a century ago.
So it's like he tapped into something fundamental about the human experience, something that resonates across time and cultures.
Exactly. And his influence extends beyond art, too. His ideas have had a profound impact on psychology, particularly in the areas of personality, motivation, and self-actualization.
Yeah, I can see that. His concept of the will to power seems like it would be pretty relevant to psychologists.
Absolutely. Thinkers like Alfred Adler and Carl Jung, who were pioneers in the field of depth psychology, were deeply influenced by Nietzsche. They saw in his work a new way of understanding the human psyche, the unconscious drives and motivations that shape our behavior.
So Nietzsche wasn't just a philosopher. He was also kind of a psychologist in a way, exploring the depths of human nature.
Yes. And his insights continue to inform therapeutic approaches and self-help movements today. He helped us to see that we're not simply passive products of our environment, but active agents in shaping our own destinies.
Okay, so we've got literature, psychology. Where else can we see Nietzsche's influence?
Well, we can't talk about Nietzsche's legacy without addressing the elephant in the room, politics.
Right, because his work has been, shall we say, appropriated by some pretty unsavory groups in the past. So does that tarnish his legacy?
It's a complex issue, and one that requires nuance. There's no denying that Nietzsche's work, particularly the concept of the Superman, was distorted and misused by the Nazi regime for their own, horrific ends.
That's a dark chapter in history, and something we can't ignore when we're talking about Nietzsche.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's crucial to remember that Nietzsche himself was fiercely critical of nationalism, anti-Semitism, and all forms of authoritarianism. In fact, his sister, Elizabeth, played a significant role in promoting a very selective and distorted reading of his work after his death, which, sadly, contributed to those misinterpretations.
So it's another case of powerful ideas being taken out of context.
Yeah.
And used for purposes that the original thinker would have abhorred.
Exactly. And it underscores the importance of engaging with Nietzsche's work critically, reading it carefully, and understanding the nuances and complexities of his thought.
It seems like that's a recurring theme with Nietzsche, like nothing is surface level.
You got it. His philosophy demands active engagement, a willingness to grapple with difficult concepts, and a healthy dose of skepticism.
So it's not about becoming a Nietzschean, it's about developing that Nietzschean spirit of inquiry, that willingness to question everything.
Exactly. He wanted to awaken our critical thinking, our intellectual independence, not to create followers.
So what does this all mean for us that, the non-philosophers just trying to navigate the world? What can we actually take away from all this?
Well, I think the most important takeaway is that Nietzsche's philosophy is a call to awaken to the possibilities of existence.
Okay, I like that. But be specific. What does that look like in practice?
It means embracing our will to power, not in a domineering sense, but in terms of striving for self-mastery, pushing our boundaries, and expressing our creative potential. It means questioning our assumptions, challenging conventional wisdom, and refusing to settle for those easy answers. It means taking responsibility for creating our own values and finding meaning in a world that might not offer it readily.
Wow, it's almost like he's saying, wake up. Life is an adventure, not a spectator sport.
Exactly. And we are the authors of our own stories. Nietzsche's legacy isn't about providing a set of rules to live by, but about equipping us with the tools to ask better questions, challenge ourselves, and embrace our extraordinary potential.
I have to admit, when we started this deep dive, I was a little intimidated, but now I'm feeling more invigorated.
Yeah.
Like there's a whole world of possibilities waiting to be explored.
That's the power of Nietzsche, you know? He doesn't give us all the answers, but he gives us the courage to ask the right questions and the freedom to forge our own paths.
And on that note, I think it's time for us to wrap up this part of our deep dive. But listeners, this isn't the end. It's just the beginning. Take what you've learned here. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep creating your own extraordinary story. We'll be back with part 3 soon. Okay, so we've talked about all these places where Nietzsche's ideas show up. Literature, psychology, even politics. But I kind of want to bring it back to us now. Like, what does taking a Nietzschean approach to life actually look like day to day?
Yeah, that's the real question, isn't it? Because Nietzsche wasn't giving us like a step-by-step guide, more like a set of tools. But if we had to like boil it down, I think it's about cultivating a certain mindset, you know? A way of being in the world that's active, engaged, and always questioning.
Okay, I like that. But give me some specifics. How do we actually shift from, reading about Nietzsche to living a little bit more Nietzsche?
Well, one key is this idea of amor fati.
It's a lot.
It's a love of fate. It's about accepting not just the good things that happen, but also the challenges, the setbacks, the things we can't control.
Yeah.
Because those are the things that shape us, force us to grow and ultimately make us stronger.
Yeah, but that's easier said than done, right? Especially when things are tough.
Yeah.
How do we get from like gritting our teeth and just bearing it to actually loving our fate?
It starts with, I think, a shift in perspective. Instead of seeing obstacles as like roadblocks, try to see them as opportunities, opportunities for growth. So when you hit a wall, don't just give up. Ask yourself, what can I learn from this? How can I use this to become more resilient, more resourceful?
So it's about reframing those negative experiences as fuel, basically, like fuel for self-improvement. Kind of like those workout classes where they make you do burpees until you want to cry, but you come out feeling amazing.
Exactly. And it ties right back into the will to power. Remember, it's not about dominating others. It's about mastering ourselves. That constant striving to become the best version of ourselves, even when faced with adversity.
Yeah, it's like life is going to throw punches no matter what. So do we cower and get knocked down? Or do we learn to roll with them and come back stronger?
That's a great analogy, and it highlights another super important aspect of Nietzschean living, self-creation. He really believed we have the power to shape our own identities, our values, our destinies. We're not just defined by our past, our circumstances, what other people expect of us.
That's pretty empowering, but also kind of daunting. Like, where do we even begin with this whole self-creation thing?
I think you start by asking yourself some tough questions. What do I actually value? What kind of person do I want to be? What legacy do I want to leave behind? Once you get a clearer sense of your own values, your aspirations, you can start making choices that line up with those goals.
So it's not about following someone else's script. It's about writing our own.
Exactly. And remember, this self-creation thing, it's an ongoing process, not a destination. So it's about constantly questioning, experimenting, pushing your boundaries, and evolving. Don't be afraid to make mistakes, to try new things, to step outside your comfort zone.
This is starting to feel less like philosophy and more like a personal development workshop.
Well, in a way, that's kind of what Nietzsche was all about. He wanted to give us the tools to live more consciously, more deliberately, more joyfully. He wanted us to become the artists of our own lives.
I like that. But that takes courage, doesn't it? Like stepping outside your comfort zone, challenging those conventional ways of thinking, that can be kind of scary.
For sure. But Nietzsche believes that true freedom comes from facing those fears, from embracing uncertainty, from taking responsibility for our own choices.
So instead of looking for comfort and security, we should be looking for growth and self-actualization, even if it means being a little uncomfortable along the way.
Exactly. And that's where the idea of the Superman, it comes back in. Remember, it's not about achieving some superhuman state. It's about striving to become the best version of ourselves, pushing beyond our limitations and creating something truly meaningful with our lives.
So it's like leveling up in a video game. But instead of getting new powers, we're expanding our consciousness, our capacity for experiencing the world, for creating, for connecting.
I love that analogy. And just like in a video game, there are going to be challenges, setbacks, even moments where you want to rage quit. But it's those moments that test us. They force us to dig deep and find that inner strength.
And ultimately, those challenges are what make the game worth playing, right?
Exactly. And that's the beauty of this Nietzschean approach. It's not about finding a life that's totally free from pain or struggle. It's about embracing the full spectrum of human experience, the joys and sorrows, the triumphs and failures, and finding meaning in the journey itself.
So not about reaching some final destination, but about becoming more fully alive,
Yeah,
more present, more engaged in each and every moment.
I think that's a great way to put it.
At the beginning of this deep dive, I was a little apprehensive, I'll admit. Nietzsche's got this reputation, right, for being a little intense. But now I'm feeling inspired, honestly. Like a whole new world of possibilities has opened up.
That's the magic of Nietzsche. He doesn't give us easy answers, but he challenges us to ask better questions, to think more deeply, and to live more authentically. And at the end of the day, those are the gifts that truly matter.
So to all you listeners out there, take what you've learned and go create your own extraordinary lives.
Yeah.
Embrace the challenge, push your boundaries, and never stop questioning. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of Nietzsche.